The questions directed at me were, does a global refugee policy exist and does it matter? And my answers are basically yes and yes. But how it matters is probably a question of how we conceptualize global refugee policies. Can we think of refugee policies as global because they're implemented globally? No, probably not, because we have many countries and regions in which global refugee policies don't really play a major role. And where global refugee policies are implemented, they're often not consistent, so implemented in different kinds of ways. What is global about refugee policies is the universal appeal it has, the non-discriminatory ideas behind it, and its aim at a global reach. Also, as many others have pointed out, the stakeholders of global refugee policies are partially international and transnational organizations, including UNHCR, but also states that work together with UNHCR and on a global level. Together, they might be considered a global refugee regime, which is then the main proponent of a global refugee policy or global refugee policies. However, when it comes to the implementation of these policies, we see that these policies will be in tension with refugee policies on a regional, national, and local level. So we have to think probably more about the negotiation and the tensions that exist when we talk about a global refugee policy in the real world. Looking at my own research about resettlement policies and the implementation, in particular why Germany implemented a resettlement quota system, we see that beyond a global refugee policy and the global refugee regime that played an important part in this, we also have to look at the asylum regime, so the nation state, Germany in this case, but also the regional refugee regime by the European Union, and the local level, the domestic policies, a political refugee regime. All these together made up a system and a negotiation that in the end led to the implementation of resettlement policies that as a norm were set by a global refugee regime, but in its implementation required much more than that. So can we speak then of a kind of multi-level governance system of which global refugee policies are one element, and maybe the overarching element? So with a global refugee policy on top, and then a regional, national, and domestic level below that. I think a hierarchical picture like this that is based on its geographic reach or its geographic appeal is probably not a correct way of describing how the implementation of refugee policies really works. Rather, I would suggest that we have to look at the political negotiation between different regimes with different norms and different principles according to which refugee protection is implemented. For this, we have to consider certain relationships of power. We have to consider the financial stakes, and we have to see how these negotiations actually happen in the real world. For that, we have to consider and have to understand the role of global refugee policies, but to understand them fully and their real-world implications, we have to consider them in relation to other refugee policies and other refugee regimes that they work together with.